Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the panel where we will be discussing today a very simple question, but one that many of us actually wonder: how to audit algorithmic risks. My name is Eliška Pirková. I work as a senior policy analyst for Access Now, and I will be moderating today's session that is organized by our partner organization and great experts on the topic, Algorithm Watch. Today, I have an excellent lineup of speakers and great experts on the topic, and I will introduce them one by one. On my left side, I have Ramsha Jahangir, Senior Policy Analyst and Communication Associate at a Global Network Initiative, and also a journalist and researcher. Welcome. Next is David Fernandez Yorca, who works as a scientific officer at the European Commission, concretely Joint Research Center. Welcome as well. Finally, I have the organizer of today's panel, Oliver Marsh, who is the lead at Algorithm Watch on the project of auditing algorithms for systemic risk, so the expert in its core. And finally, Martin Degeling from SNV, the institute that is very known and gathers a lot of expertise, but I will prefer not to pronounce the whole entire name of the institute because I would insult all German speakers in the room. Who is actually a technical expert on auditing recommender systems. And also, he's looking into analyzing and evaluating AI-based recommendation system for internet intermediaries. Welcome, everyone. And before I will give the space to our speakers to kick off with their first introductions to set the scene, we would like to check a temperature in the room. So if you don't mind, I will ask a few questions from you, the audience. So by a show of hands, who sees themselves as primarily either civil society or NGO? Please raise your hands. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Quite a few of you in the room. Now, who represents governments and regulators? Wow, it's almost even. And who identifies as companies and private actors or technology developers? Okay, it's a quite diverse representation. I have another question for you. Who would say that they are auditors or they have experience with auditing algorithms and have conducted such audits in the past? Okay. Now, very legalistic question. Who is actually familiar with the Digital Services Act or with the European Union AI Act? And on the other hand, who doesn't really feel familiar with these legislations? Okay, all experts in the room. Fantastic. We basically have no job to do. And one final question. Are there any organizations, activists, who are not based in the EU and who represent non-EU voices today? Amazing. Good to see you. Thank you very much for your cooperation. And without undue delay now, I would like to turn back to our panel. And starting with you, Ramsha, I would like to ask you to set the scene and introduce your first introductory remarks on the topic of auditing algorithms.
Thank you, Eliška, and welcome everyone to our panel. We're hoping to provide you with some useful insights, but also hear back from you, because I see an interesting mix of experts present here. So I'm speaking here on behalf of Global Network Initiative. For those of you who don't know GNI is a multi-stakeholder collaboration. So we work with tech companies, civil society, academia, as well as investors, focusing on freedom of expression and privacy issues. So there's one part of it is creating shared learning and policy on these issues, but there's another part which is tech accountability, which is core to GNI's work. To tell you more about that process, so GNI's experience is informed now by 4 cycles of assessments of member tech companies, and those assessments look at internal systems and processes and how they address and identify risks to freedom of expression and privacy. This multi-stakeholder independent assessment provides insights into member companies' practices and policies, like I said, but it also fosters engagement and conversations about the assessment process within the GNI membership. And we deal with independent assessors, as I mentioned, and we also train those independent assessors. There's a detailed assessment toolkit available on our website that details this entire process, as well as expectations from those assessors. Once those assessors are trained, they review materials as well as interview member companies and their employees. And then they inform our independent and multi-stakeholder board, as well as an accountability committee, to make decisions if the companies are implementing these practices well, and also to suggest recommendations for improvement over time. So that's more or less what GNI does. So how do our lessons inform what's happening in the DSA context? And that will be the focus of my interventions today. So we have a few big, broad concerns. One of them is about audits. Actually, many of them are about audits, but more specifically on the lack of standard definitions, methodologies, or benchmarks for conducting audits under DSA. This raises this risk that process will not be rigorous or comparable, which in turn could have unintended consequences for human rights. Audits under DSA expect more from these audits in a way which may be reasonable, or as we will discuss more about assessing what compliance means under DSA. They create risks that it could discourage discovery of mistakes, learning, and improvement over time because of those very, very strict requirements in the lack of standards and concrete methodologies. Another big issue, and I see a lot of people familiar with auditing here present in the room, is, and they might be able to relate or prove me wrong, but auditor eligibility is quite limited in this space. It's a quite new area. DSA risk assessments and audits are in the first year. This is a new exercise. We're all learning, and there's very, very limited capacity that we've also observed. And then transparency is another key issue. Transparency around these risk assessments as well as audits. And then tying to that is also how involved is civil society. So stakeholder engagement, as I mentioned, GNI is a multi-stakeholder collaboration. So input from civil society and diverse stakeholders is key to those risk assessments. One of those concerns is also about stakeholder engagement, how we can improve it, and I'm happy to talk more about that in my second intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramsha. And one thing which you nicely pointed out in your intervention is that, yes, indeed, today we are looking into the audits under Article 37 of the DSA and the Delegated Act, but not only. These risk management approach and audits, we would like to analyze them in a rather more broader picture, including looking into EU AI Act. And we are also looking into those, as you call them, external assessors or external independent third-party auditors. And I very much like the term that was developed by SNV, by your work, Martin, together with Kati Messner, which I believe is in the room today, your colleague, so-called compliance audits. We also then show a PowerPoint slide with the resources by these excellent experts and organizations who have already looked into independent auditing and risk assessment, and you can go and read those resources yourself after the session. But speaking of EU AI Act, going to you, David, could you just introduce and set the scene a bit in 3 minutes, if possible? Thank you.
I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do it in 3 minutes, but well, thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for the interest in this panel. I'm David Fernandez Yorca. I have a technical background. I'm not a legal expert. I have been working at the GRC for more than 3 years at the European Commission. I'm also part of the European Center of Algorithmic Transparency. And I'm going to focus my intervention here. I'm going to be like a bit of, I feel like an outlier here within the panel because I'm going to focus most of my comments on the AI Act because I've been supporting the AI Act for the last months, even years. For those of you that do not know about the GRC, it's an in-house research institution within the Commission that is basically doing research and providing technical support and scientific evidence to support better regulation, so for policy DGs, mostly in Brussels. And basically, based on the work that I have been doing during the last years on the AI Act, I wanted to target the topic of audit. Well, in the context of artificial intelligence, maybe terminology is also evaluating algorithmic risks or evaluating AI risks within the context of the AI Act. But I have to also clarify that I'm presented here. This is the disclaimer, and all the opinions are basically, or my comments are my opinions, my personal opinions. I'm not representing the Commission. My views are not, cannot be considered by any means as the official position of the Commission. This is important for me to establish here. So, whereas the DSA is focusing on intermediary services, you know that the AI Act is product legislation, but it's not any kind of product legislation. It's a very special one due to mainly three aspects. The first one is the horizontality characteristics of the regulation. It's going to affect to some unregulated areas, very different ones. We can have, we are talking about the use cases, the high-risk use cases, no? We have from, we have from biometrics, law enforcement, employment, education, etc. Then it's going to affect also regulated sectors. So all this old framework, new legislative framework, and this is the horizontality is one of the special characteristics. The second one is the focus on risks to fundamental rights. This is very new in the context of product legislation, as you all know. Before the AI Act, product legislation is basically focusing on or targeting risks to health and mostly safety. No? So fundamental rights is really a novelty here. And finally, the focus on systemic risks of some AI models. Those models that they show significant generality, the so-called general purpose AI models, that can be also, if they have high impact capabilities, they are considered models with systemic risks, and the focus is also there. So these are the three elements that make this product legislation a very special one, and all this innovation is also carrying a lot of difficulties, challenges, as you can imagine. So again, thank you very much for inviting me and for being, it's a pleasure to be here. I would like to, I guess that with the AI Act, we have to maybe be a step behind. The DSA is in the earlier stages, but with the AI, we haven't started yet. So I will try to put some context on this topic within the AI. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very useful perspective indeed. Oliver, going to you and more sort of data-related and technical aspects of auditing of algorithms. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much. I actually want to pick up where David left off by saying that the AI Act will be, one might say, behind the DSA, but that means we can learn from the DSA, and that's what we're trying to do. The project that I'm running at Algorithm Watch at the moment is, again, mostly focused on the DSA, but looking at broader lessons for other tech legislation, AI Act, and beyond. And work we've been doing currently, which is relevant to this, is mostly focusing on how external actors, particularly civil society organizations and researchers, can contribute as an ecosystem to these kind of effective audits. And the work we've been doing to that end specifically is something we've been calling the risk repository, where we've been crowdsourcing examples, potential cases of systemic risks under the Digital Services Act. So that might be the deep-faked audio in Slovakian elections, evidence of TikTok and Instagram's feeds recommending violent content to young people, research that Twitter/X might have impacts on polarization, cases like that. And then crucially, distributing these cases amongst various expert organizations and individuals, particularly amongst the civil society community, and asking, do you think that these count as systemic risks under the DSA framework? And crucially, how did you come to that conclusion? And what we're finding, and this is from very, very initial results, we're still seeking expert input, so if you're interested, get in touch, please. But from these very initial results, what we're finding is Unsurprisingly, there is a very wide, diverse ecosystem with lots of different methods, approaches, frameworks, tools, from human rights backgrounds through to technical assessments, through to impacts and learning from users on how they are experiencing those impacts in the world. That is very good, in theory. The problem is, in the current environment of the DSA, which Ramsha has already pointed out, there is a lot of lack of clarity around, for instance, what systemic actually means, and therefore what the fundamental goal of this process should be. And this means that different organizations looking at the same cases can come to different conclusions, and it also has practical implications when we're in resource-constrained environments and very sort of time-limited environments, how we can direct our efforts and best coordinate. Let me give you an example. If the idea of systemic risks has to also involve a method of, or a mention of causality, or at least high probability, that's very hard for a civil society organization to do. That's the sort of research that academics would normally do in slower time. Should we as civil society be trying to develop these methods and improve on these practices? Or is causality and probability a minor part of systemic risks? And we can work with academics further down the line to establish causality, but the work we do now would still be relevant and valuable, even if we're not doing it in a kind of probabilistic fashion. These are unanswered questions which have real practical implications for how we spread our resources. And this is worsened in an environment of not much transparency, where we can't even see the risk assessments that have been produced, so we don't know what the gaps are, and we don't know where best to put our resources and our learning and our expertise. To borrow a metaphor, there's the metaphor of throwing mud at a wall. We can keep throwing mud at a wall and see what sticks, but it's a massive wall and we don't have much mud. So it'd be good to have a bit of kind of coordination based on the legislation. And I'll finish on this point because I want to expand it to broader than the DSA. Legislation is obviously a governing mechanism. It's obviously an empowering mechanism and an accountability mechanism. It's also a kind of rallying point and a coordination point for many different actors, including researchers and civil society. And there is an opportunity to make this a rally, the idea of auditing systemic risks, a way of plugging in lots of different expertise to produce a good output. But that won't happen in an environment of not much clarity and not much transparency. And I do think that some of the conditions that make that the case, some of the suspicion from tech companies, for instance, and some of the nervousness about sharing too much information is going to persist in other tech legislation. And it's an issue that needs to be discussed as we go forward.
Hear, hear. Now to you, Martin. Speaking of methodologies and the clarity, SNV was one of the first organizations who sort of envisioned and proposed a framework how these audits could unfold specifically under the DSA. Could you, and in the context of content recommender system, could you introduce your work?
Yes, thanks, and thanks for inviting me. And yes, I'm representing SNV, soon to be Interface, to make it easier for the non-German speakers. We've been answering some of the questions that Ollie has posed with our answers and with our type of mud. And I'm working in the team with Kat, who is also here, but we are a small team at a civil society organization. In the beginning of the DSA, we tried to come up with an idea of what does it actually mean to analyze systemic risks on a recommender system-based platform. And for that approach, the risk scenario, is it only monitor that is not working, or can you hear me? Okay. We developed an approach that we call the risk scenario-based audit process, where we try to narrow down systemic risks to specific harms for individual users of a platform. And then we spent the last roughly 1.5 years trying to use this approach on one specific platform, which in our case is TikTok, and try to analyze the platform and do some kind of stakeholder involvement, surveying users, but also using the technical approaches that we have and that the DSA now allows us to use, like the data access provisions, which basically didn't work so far, to actually get an idea of can we find the systemic risk, or can we confirm that that there are specific systemic risks within TikTok. And now we try to feed back these results that, if you're interested, can read on our audit blog, tiktok-audit.com. And we're trying to feed back our results and also the learnings from the process that we did back to the discussions of how we can do third-party audits on platforms.
Thank you so much for your introductory remarks. And now, maybe going back to the point that was raised by you, Oliver, as well, those external players that play significant role in auditing process and risk assessment process from academia, civil society organizations. What different roles can these different players take upon themselves in order to make these auditing and risk assessment exercise truly meaningful? And especially how they can actually work together, how that ideal joint system of cooperation should look like. And we can start from you, Oliver, and maybe then go to Martin.
Sure. So again, I'll start with the DSA and then expand it. No, I won't actually. I'll start with the expansive point and then go into the DSA. So one of the big questions is, firstly, how to bring in lots of varied expertise. I think most would agree that's a really sensible idea. This isn't just a technical problem. This is a question of things like human rights and impact on people. So you can't just involve just technical expertise. So you want, as I say, this ecosystem. The trade-offs that have to be made involve how much information is given to different actors in an ecosystem with risks of things like privacy, trade secrets violations, etc. And this is a trade-off that must be made, but has, I think, systematically been biased in the favor, particularly since sort of 2016 or so, since the Cambridge Analytica overhype, has been platforms have had excuses to not give information and to keep data to themselves. Although these concerns around privacy and trade secrets are in some cases very real, obviously. So to go to the DSA, the way this trade-off is managed is you do have a kind of tiered access system. So you have the Commission, you have actors working with the Commission or parts of the Commission, ECAT, for instance, and digital services coordinators who get some privileged access to certain kinds of data and have, one would hope, a more ongoing relationship with the platforms. You also have the idea of vetted researchers who, by demonstrating they are competent to keep data to themselves and not run privacy risks and use it responsibly, get, again, more, maybe not ongoing and continual, but sort of can make data access requests, for instance. And then you have a much wider ecosystem, which might include journalists, people on the ground, users as well. There are user flagging mechanisms within the DSA, all of which can feed in information. So the idea is you can have some in-depth research from vetted researchers and ECAT and others who can look at quite expansive forms of data, and then also lots of other people who might not have access to that data but can say, hey, we've spotted a thing, this is affecting my community or this is affecting me as a user, can you look into it? And through aggregating that, you come up with some issues that need to be resolved. Again, it's great in theory. The problem is, firstly, as Martin alluded to, the data access provisions under the DSA are just not working at the moment. And there is a problem that was raised on a panel yesterday about the term used was great. It's called I'm trying to remember, a dialogue deficit or something, where to have this ecosystem working effectively, everyone needs to be involved and everyone needs to be participating. And a lot of the time, unfortunately, just the platforms are kind of only half participating or not participating. For instance, data access requests really should be an iterative process, but there's a lot of things in the DSA that allow for that to be delayed. So that instead of going, yep, here's some data, you go, okay, can we have this data? And the platform goes, oh, we don't have that data. Do you want something that could be a little bit irrelevant? This isn't just the DSA. The Meta Oversight Board has the same problem. So there is this route for different ecosystems to be involved in different levels, and that's great, but it does need to involve a certain degree of collaboration that is, I think, under the current framework, very hard.
Actually, I think this is a great moment to touch upon data access framework, which is under Article 40 in the DSA, and we are all impatiently waiting for delegated act on data access framework that should be coming soon. Martin, what is actually the role of data access? Why is it necessary and needed? We all have obvious answers, but maybe there is something even more important that we're missing in this context. And why is it so difficult to achieve it?
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think Oliver already mentioned that there's like multiple levels of access, but also multiple stakeholders involved that like to have access, and obviously that means that they also have different technical competences, for example, to get access to the data, right? So as a computer scientist, for me, it's rather easy to use an API or to actually try to scrape a platform to get insights into different data points, but that's limited by whatever the platform is offering and allowing me to access. And but for others, like journalists, whatever, you might have heard about the CrawlTangle discussions over the last month, which was actually a tool, or is still a tool, that Meta allows journalists and other researchers to use to actually study what's happening on the platform. But they are shutting this down and instead referring to the API, which has, provides to be difficult to be used by a lot of researchers that don't have the technical expertise to use APIs. So, and then there's an additional problem that comes with what is made available through the APIs, right? So the platforms then control what data they give access to, and with respect to TikTok, I can talk about that because that's what we've looked into. It's what Ollie also mentioned. We don't have access because although the DSA asks platforms to offer at least access to the public data, also to non-vetted researchers and civil society organizations, for TikTok it's still the case that they only allow academic researchers to access this API. So, and we've talked to some academic researchers that do have access right now, and they are also saying, okay, there are several limitations when it comes to, for example, rate limiting, so the number of questions you can ask the API per day, and there's obviously also things that we can see from the outside looking at the APIs, that the data points they are providing are just very limited, which means that also the research questions you can answer with accessing the API are limited, right? So they are giving you only a fraction of the information that we know from looking deeper into their systems from the outside, what they actually have with respect to, labeling of videos or comments or how the videos spread, what are the most liked videos of the day and something like that. These are all information that we are missing, but that would be crucial to actually successfully use the API to understand what's happening on the platforms and to assess the risks.
Thank you. And indeed, without adequate and meaningful transparency, that cannot be a proper accountability by watchdogs and external players, which brings me to my next question. We discussed compliance audits. We discuss how external players with relevant expertise can actually adequately exercise this function without unnecessary obstacles. But how such a stakeholder engagement, focusing on compliance and accountability, should look like? Or do we have that mechanism? Is it formalized enough? Ramsha, over to you.
That's a tough one, I'll be honest, especially in the post-DSA context, because now companies are in the compliance phase. So existing whatever partnerships and engagement they had with civil society has, and the feedback from civil society has been that it's not as extensive as it used to be. So that's a big question. Two questions. Who are stakeholders that companies should engage? And then what should this engagement look like? So recital 90 of DSA, for instance, does emphasize stakeholder engagement, but it doesn't detail who are these stakeholders, what should be prioritized, what this engagement should look like. And again, it goes back to the point of lack of guidance within the DSA on how these mechanisms will look like in practice. One of the things I would actually quote is a fantastic piece from Daphne Keller on the three-body problem of platform litigation. And this talks about, is there a formal limit within the DSA on what agreements can be reached other than general monitoring? And is there any process for the public or civil society and other relevant actors to know about the challenges and also know about the platform's negotiated deal before it becomes binding? So we already, I think Oliver mentioned that the risk assessments will be published, and by the time they will be, it will be firstly redacted and they will be out of date. So it's too late to react to. Second, if the commission and other actors involved decide that the companies were not in compliance, are there any tools or mechanisms in place to question that or to know what the approach was or what went on behind the scenes? So those are some kind of, this lack of clarity affects stakeholder engagement in this current environment. So what can be done in this space? So GNI held workshops last year in partnership with DTSP, Digital Safety Trust Partnership, with our company members and also civil society. I think Access Now, Ilishka was part of it as well. And also global stakeholders, because I think this conversation needs to extend beyond European users as much as it is about Europe. Global stakeholders are still part of it. And we had a facilitated conversation on what systemic risks look like. What are some of the challenges that companies expect to, because then they were not in, DSA was not in effect, what challenges they expect, and what is the kind of feedback civil society can provide. I will dwell on what some of those outcomes were maybe later, but what I'm trying to say is we're, as GNI, as a multi-stakeholder collaboration, trying to continue facilitating those structured conversations, because I think that setting worked well for companies as well as civil society. So we're continuing to promote that multi-stakeholder model, because that's what we found works best in risk assessments and accountability practices. But one of the challenges that we're facing as well is there's obviously this need for confidentiality, and some of the things that Oliver already spoke to that companies now have to take into consideration. How much can they actually share? Again, going back to the lack of clarity in DSA, because there is no clarity on what this engagement looks like. There is this question mark, right? Like, how much can companies actually confidentially share, which will not go back to bite them, or which will decide if this was in compliance or not. Those are questions that we're also facing in our facilitated multi-stakeholder collaboration. But that is not to say if Commission is not providing that guidance, it doesn't mean that other actors can't. And this panel is evidence of that in our individual capacities and in collaborating with each other. We're trying to produce that sort of guidance and create those spaces where these conversations can happen, and potentially, hopefully, prompt the Commission to create guidance and inform what this guidance would look like.
Thank you so much. And just a gentle reminder that Article 34 on risk assessments under the DSA does foresee informal guidance that can be issued by the Commission. Now, maybe taking a step back from the DSA and turning more into AI Act. David, what are those main risks that are considered within the AI Act, in which context they can happen, and at which levels are these risks imposed by systems or models? Could you walk us through it?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I will say a few things about for example, the data access, the Article 41st self-promotion. Tomorrow at 8:30 there is a specific panel, Article 40, organized by the European Centre of Algorithmic Transparency. Sorry, at 8:30. Okay. I'm gonna use it. Thank you. So that was the first thing that I wanted to say. But it is true that in the AI Act, for example, there is nothing like the Article 40 to have some better researchers, specific access to models, etc. But we have an ecosystem of actors that it's also relevant to mention and to highlight, because there is a way to engage with the stakeholders, just to link firstly with the previous question. No? We have the advisory forum, which is going to be composed of different stakeholders, including civil society, academia, including also industry, standardization bodies, etc. The role of this forum is going to advise, obviously, but it's going to have an effect both in the enforcement of the part on high-risk AI systems, but also on the part of general-purpose AI models with systemic risks. And there is a very interesting new actor, which is the scientific panel, which is going to be composed of an independent pool of independent experts. And this panel is going to play a key role. For me, this is my personal view, again, but this is like the acknowledgement that the kind of activities that have to be done during the enforcement of the AI Act for general-purpose AI models most of them are still in a research stage. There is a lot of research that has to be done, and the engagement with the research community is clear. So by means of this scientific panel, it can serve as an interface between the scientific community and the AI office. And this scientific panel can trigger alerts on some specific models to the AI office, so the AI office can start with some specific investigations related to some specific models. No? So this is what I wanted to mention. And now, related to the context of the risks, because I really think that we have to put some context. you know that we have like 2 layers in the AI Act. We have first the layer focusing on systems, on AI systems, on products with AI, and we know that we have this, the risk is always there in the AI Act. We have the risk as the common threat in the regulation, in the classification of model systems, in the enforcement, in the requirements. The risks is always there. And we have this layer approach, you know, with no risk, limited risk, high risk, and unacceptable risks. And the narrative behind this is basically AI has some intrinsic features, such as opacity, lack of causality, unpredictability, possible harmful bias, etc., that have to be taken into account. When we put this technology into a product, we have to be careful, we have to put some requirements, etc. But again, the horizontality, we have unregulated sectors that we are developing, well, standardization bodies, they are now developing the harmonized standards for these high-risk AI systems. And basically, we all can imagine the difficulty of developing horizontal standards for so many different use cases. I'm talking about biometrics, but also critical infrastructure, employment, education, law enforcement. So we all can imagine the difficulty of this. But on top of that, these communities are so technical, as Oliver was mentioning, and they have to incorporate expertise related with fundamental rights, because they are very well used to cover risks to safety and to some degree also to health, but fundamental rights is a new thing for these communities, and they have to incorporate this expertise. Then we have also the risks related with the requirements. We have the risk management system, all the requirements, data governance, we have accuracy, robustness, etc. But then I would like to mention also the other part of the regulation, which is also very important, is the one that is going to be enforced by the AI Office, by the Commission, which is the part on the models. And here there is also a link with the DSA because, well, we have, again, a layer approach. We have AI models, narrow AI models. There are no specifications for these kind of models. So this can be like no risk or limited risk. Then we have those models that they show significant generality. They are capable of competently perform a wide range of tasks. Those models are so-called general purpose AI models. We know that the community is also referring to these models as foundation models, but the term in the AI Act is general purpose AI models. They want to emphasize the generality aspect of these models. They can be integrated in many different applications, in many different domains. So for those models, we have transparency requirements. We can have the equivalence with systems as limited risks, no? And then we have the second tier, the second element, which is probably the most critical one here, those models that have high impact capabilities. For those models, it is considered that they are models with systemic risks. And then the co-legislators have introduced a set of requirements on these specific models. But again, the risk is the underlying threat in all these, the definition of these 2 layers within the AI Act. And the concept of systemic risks in the AI Act slightly differs from the DSA. We know that the main trigger in the DSA is the number of active recipients, to consider that we have some platforms that have a lot of users, and then any negative impact that can be there can be considered systemic. But then we have to go into the details of what is a systemic risk, as the word Oliver was mentioning. No? In the AI Act, we have a different kind of trigger. We have on the one hand, well, the main underlying aspect is the high impact capabilities, or the capabilities of these models. We have a proxy related with the compute, the training compute. If these models are being trained with an amount of cumulative training compute in floating point operations larger than a threshold, then they are presumed to have systemic risk. But for those models that are below the threshold, there are still this possibility to, by means of benchmarks, evaluating all the risks and the link with all the capabilities and the link with the systemic risk, they can be considered general purpose AI models with systemic risk. And so basically that is the ecosystem, and risk assessment is included in many parts of the regulation. So It's included, of course, in the requirements for high-risk AI system. It's included in the requirements for general-purpose AI models with systemic risks. It's also part of the classification criteria of these models. So the part of the evaluation on capabilities risk is through all the AI Act. That's what I want to mention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very conscious of time, so this is the next set of questions for you, and I would like to ask you to be very concise when answering those so we can then move to audience and to Q&As. So we heard about the benchmarks, and we also know that under the DSA, the Delegated Act on Independent Audits doesn't really contain those, nor does it specify a methodology. So Ramsha, over to you. And to quote you, based on your article, you wrote, companies get to provide the answer key against which auditors will grade their homework, precisely due to that lack of methodology and benchmark systems and so on. So could you give us an overview of how those forms of accountability across technology industry look like, and what is working, what is not working, and what are those lessons learned?
There are many lessons to be learned, long story short. Some things that I've already mentioned have been discussed to detail here is the lack of benchmark and why does it matter? So going back to the workshops that I mentioned in my previous intervention, the multi-stakeholder workshop, we had 11 out of 17 VLOPs plus search engines present in the conversation along with civil society and global stakeholders. And the group produced 9 different definitions on systemic risks under DSA. This is just one example to show how this is broad and open to interpretation and why this is the lack of benchmarking is a problem. So what happens is that likely the scenario is that the risk assessments, because everyone is interpreting it differently, and Oliver has talked a lot about why systemic risks can differ depending on what platform you're talking about, the political context, the member state. There are many reasons why systemic risks can differ. Whatever outcomes come out of that would be less comparable because, again, different platforms will approach it differently. Different auditors will approach it differently because no one, frankly, has any guidance. The other issue is the expertise issue. There is already a small group of auditors who are, I don't even want to say a number, but there are very, very few group of auditors who feel that they even qualify for the independent criteria under DSA. And auditors who are obviously, this is a new space, we're learning about it. In the financial sector, for instance, or in the banking sector, defining risks is easier than, for instance, in DSA. For instance, like media pluralism is very subjective, you know. So we already have that issue that this is a new space. Then we have a very, very limited group of auditors who qualify for the independence criteria. And then lastly, we also have this complex methodology within DSA where auditors, if they don't understand a system's process or need access to a system, they will obviously rely on companies to do that. But within DSA, and I'm actually going to read that out, why this is complex, if they depend on platforms to identify, explain, and provide access to the systems that will need to be audited, the DRA, the delegated regulation, actually addresses it by stating that VLOPs should not impose, give any guidance, or otherwise influence the auditing organization through their choice and execution of audit procedures, methodologies, collection and processing of information, and audit evidence, analysis, tests, audit opinion, or elaboration of audit conclusions. Yet other parts of the DRA require that companies choose the benchmarks against which provisions should be audited and furnish information and expertise to the auditor so that the auditor can understand and assess relevant systems and policies. So you see how difficult it is a place to be an auditor under DSA and why this creates a huge issue. Lastly, my final point is the reasonable assurance. There's this requirement for reasonable assurance for auditors to assess compliance under DSA, and Because this is the first year and there are lack of benchmarks, we recommend that at least lower the limit for reasonable assurance, because that's a very, very high standard, and it gives a lot of emphasis on auditors being very, very confident in their assessment of platforms and their compliance. So yeah, either clarify what is needed, give guidelines, or at least lower the limit, at least for the initial year, so that there is room for interpretation and improvement.
I'm very sorry. We really need to move on. Just very quickly going to you, David, in terms of systemic risks under the AI Act, where do you see the biggest challenges when we are evaluating these risks? And of course, the risk-based approach under the AI Act was heavily criticized by civil societies regarding the high-risk AI systems within the law. So just very quickly, in 2 minutes, if you can wrap it up for us, that would be great.
Well, concerning high-risk AI systems, the most important challenges that I see are basically regarding the already mentioned characteristics of horizontality and focus on fundamental rights. For standardization bodies, the standardization request is really a difficulty for standardization committees that are mostly technical, and they have to deal also with risks to fundamental rights and develop the standards. We all want universal standards for everything, but the thing is that when we go into the details of every use case, every particular scenario, there are a lot of specificities, both for high-risk AI systems, also for general-purpose AI models, and it's really, really complicated to go to come up with a set of horizontal, harmonized standards. Still, they are working on it. We hope that the result is positive. Let's see. And also I see a clear challenge for adapting. We don't have to forget the sectoral application of the AI Act to many different domains, from machinery, medical devices, civil aviation, motor vehicles. That part is there. We don't have to forget it. And those are very well-established sectors. They have all these very well-established procedures, standardized methods for certification, type approval, etc. As long as they are introducing AI in the safety components, devices, products that they are incorporating into these sectors, they're going to be affected by the AI Act, and they have to also deal with the requirements of the AI Act, including risks or risk management regarding fundamental rights. For them, it's going to be a very important challenge. And finally, just regarding general purpose AI models with systemic risk, we have similar issues regarding as compared with the DSA. Access to the model, for example, availability of standardized benchmarks to evaluate capabilities, to evaluate harmful behaviors, etc., and standardized methodologies, for example, to evaluate the training compute, and also issues related with the validity of the evaluations, repeatability, reproducibility, etc.
Thank you so much. And final question for you two. So the landscape is changing with companies making their models more open. We now have new institutes popping up, such as the UK AI Safety Institute, that has or will receive the privileged access to models and codes of these companies. So how useful this will actually be, in your view?
I'd actually first say 2 sentences about your previous questions, because I'm rather critical of the standardization and benchmarks question, because, of course, tech companies are optimizing for benchmarks, right? And if you have specific benchmarks, you will have a race for optimizing the audits just for this benchmark, right? And if we're talking about the systemic risks, these are not, sometimes it's hard to benchmark them, right? And if you have the same benchmark for different companies, they all have different platforms. Platforms consist of different elements, right? And they constantly change. So if you set a specific benchmark, what would that even be? Like, which platform is causing the lower suicidal rates for teenagers? So is this a benchmark we will actually aim for, right? So I'm rather skeptical of that, and I think we should be open to and critical of what benchmarks we set for the platforms and what the platforms come up with benchmarks. I would always be eyeing for what are they actually not looking at by posing, like setting up this benchmark, what is actually, not represented in that. So that's just towards the previous point. And the second thing about the openness, it's similar to the data access question. yeah, you have to look at what specifically they are opening up to and for. How are they providing access? So especially with AI models, are you available to fully evaluate it, or does openness just mean you have access to an API and then can do whatever the API allows?
Oliver?
Yeah, I'll very quickly add. This goes back to the dialogue point. Making more things available is great, but not if it's just there, you can't understand it, and then you say to the platform, okay, what does this mean? And you get dead silence and radio silence. These are points around which we can have conversations. You should be able to have conversations to be able to work together to understand when we ask for certain kinds of data, what does it actually mean? Does it actually answer our question? And have that kind of positive engagement rather than, here's a thing, now leave us alone, which can happen. So it can be a kind of compliance theatre. So opening things up, great, but there needs to be the opportunity to have that collaboration and dialogue around them from multiple perspectives.
Thank you so much. And now it's the time to open floor for your questions. I already see one in the back.
While the microphones go around,
Second
venue team, could we get the one slide we have in the background just while we're answering questions? Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I don't know if Gianclaudio Malgeri, Leiden University. I had a very practical but difficult question. We talked a lot about procedure, but what about content of risk analysis? So do you have in your experiences proxies for measuring severity of harm to fundamental rights? Of course, there's this big question, right-based approach, harm-based approach, but the severity point, the quantification of severity, do you use the Danish Institute or other proxies? Just curious, thank you.
Shall we take more questions, or maybe 2 more questions and then note them down? Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Connor Dunlop. I'm from the Ada Lovelace Institute. Thank you so much for that panel. I'm working on the AI Act mostly. And yeah, I'm thinking a lot about general purpose AI models and the question of systemic risk under the AI Act. So I'm a bit concerned that all of that work will be operationalized by a code of practice that will be drafted primarily by industry. So I'm a bit concerned that the great learnings that you've shared from civil society will not be fed into that process and will make, some of the same challenges will arise, particularly around access, for example. David, you also mentioned that we need to use the scientific community. I strongly think they should be part of the code of practice for general purpose AI models. So my question is there any ideas how to avoid the same pitfalls under the AI Act? And is one of the solutions to have a multi-stakeholder process for the code of practice? Thank you.
Maybe 3rd question, and then we can start answering over there. Or sorry, go ahead, no worries.
Hello. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the panel. Valentina Golunova from Maastricht University. I would like you to delve a little bit more into the notion of algorithmic opacity, because the issue of transparency has, of course, been rightly raised by all of the panelists. But we can imagine that sometimes, even if we have some data and we have the algorithm, then still it's not possible to deduce why it produces certain outcomes, because we do not have access to the full infrastructure, or because the algorithm is also designed to operate in such a way intentionally. It's not always an inherent feature of algorithms. So how could we account for this limitation when it comes to algorithmic auditing? And taking a step further, maybe, could algorithmic opacity also be qualified as a systemic risk? And if so, then under what circumstances, and how could we go about measuring and studying it? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we can start with the first question, which was about fundamental rights, impact assessments, proxies, and methodologies. I'm looking at you. Who would like to take it? Oliver, I have a feeling you could.
I can very quickly say on the question of severity. So when we've been doing this risk repository work, different organizations do have different metrics, benchmarks, etc. Ilishka Access Now has one on fundamental rights assessments, etc. Martin's mentioned the risk scenarios, so different methods and approaches. I don't think I've seen one that actually, I was about to say I don't think I've seen one that strictly classifies severity. I believe that CERRE are coming out with something on elections in the next few months, which I don't think has a clear measure of severity, but like a quantitative benchmark, but does raise it as, here are things you should consider when you're thinking about severity. I actually want to combine, if it's okay, the question with Valentina's question. And Valentina is who I was trying to cite earlier, and I completely forgot your name. I do apologize. But Valentina made an excellent point yesterday about this dialogic process, and I really recommend your work on this to everyone. I think here's a way the DSA can maybe learn from the AI Act and some of the things that David has been saying. There are so many different possibilities in which platforms could theoretically create risks or harms or systemic risks. Trying to say a kind of umbrella thing probably won't work. So again, in some cases, yes, we probably will have situations where it is, here is an algorithm that is optimizing certain things in a way that clearly produces quantifiable levels of harm. That will be one way of looking at certain things. There will be other times where it's something like some combination of content moderation policies and lack of training of content moderators, something which might be quantifiable but possibly isn't, is the source of the problem. So it will be really hard to have this kind of, here is one kind of benchmark that covers everything or definition that covers everything. So again, just to bang the same point home, we will need to learn and iterate as we go. We will need to have access to all kinds of different discussions and routes to feed up concerns and learn about how best to assess them. And that can only happen if the processes by which we can access data, request more data, iterate our research questions, develop our research as we go to actually focus in what we're trying to minimize, which is some kind of risk or harm, can be done. And that isn't really possible when a lot of the processes are sort of put in a data access request and hope something comes back in goodness knows how long, or you have, as Martin says, an API that seems to be giving as little information as it can possibly get away with. So yeah, I'll do 1 and 3. I'll leave the other one.
I think this is a nice segue to you, Martin, and if that's okay, I will start with Valentina's question. So about algorithmic opacity, should that be a systemic risk? And then perhaps moving to you, David, on the code of conduct and the third question.
Yeah. So, like from the legal side, I don't have an idea of whether that can be a systemic risk or not. I think it is a risk to any research, right? Because if the opacity is very high and you cannot get a hold of specific features that are causing or are related to the outcomes you're looking for, that is a problem to research questions. And I guess the companies and researchers should try to narrow down the things they are looking at or looking for to actually try to remove the opacity. And I think because as third-party auditors, we deal with that anyway, right? So we don't have access to the models, we don't have access to the specific weights, whatever are in recommender systems, for example, but we can look at what's happening, what we can get out of the black box, right? And that's what we're assessing. And for that, it's not always necessary to fully understand what's happening, but to assess a risk can also happen without knowing all the internals.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, just a quick comment on capacity or capabilities. I think is the main narrative to focus on general purpose AI models that are so-called with systemic risk is basically that they have high impact capabilities. And the research community right now is focusing very much in evaluating the capabilities of these models. We know that the providers of these models, they haven't reached any limit. They are like scaling up in terms of the models, the training data, the compute, the training compute, and they are then empirically evaluating the capabilities, and they are realizing that, okay, we haven't achieved any limit there, so we can scale up, we can go farther away. So the part on evaluating the capabilities is a clear research topic right now, very important. It's going to be very important also for the enforcement of the AI Act, for the AI office, and it's going to be part of the relationship between the scientific panel and the engagement with the scientific community with the AI office for that particular part. Still, establishing clear causality between the capabilities and the specific systemic risk is an unknown, I will say. We are not there yet, at least from a research point of view. And then on the code of practice, I don't think that is something that is going to be I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that has to be guided by industry. For example, I think there is room for civil society to play a role for multiple SMEs, not just big companies, different kind of industry, different kind of stakeholders that they can participate in the code of practice. The Commission is not taking any active part, it's just guiding the process. So the code of practice is going to be something developed by third parties. And we have an example of the code of practice on disinformation. No? We will see if this is something efficient or no. Again, with the AI Act, we haven't started yet, so there are a lot of unknowns. But I think there is room for civil society to engage by means of the advisory forum, by means also of the scientific panel. Some of the evidence that we have about harmful behaviors of these models is thanks to the civil society. I mean, this citizen science that we call people in some communities doing red teaming, adversarial testing with those models, and sharing the results with the research community, right? It's not just academics, it's just also people from some communities that they are, and these are evaluations that are going to be taken into account for sure by the AI Office in the enforcement.
We still have time for 2 more questions. Okay, I see there.
Thanks. You made some really good parallels with product safety audits, David, and kind of explaining how a lot of the community has come from that space and also kind of is adopting those practices, and that the fundamental rights aspect is a bit complicated or is a bit new. And I wondered if there's anything that can be learned from the GDPR Article 58 audits of data protection authorities having the power to do data protection audits, which are fundamental rights audits. So whether that's something that you or others on the panel have considered. Thanks.
And we can also take the second question now.
Hi, I'm Jeff Allen from the Integrity Institute. So the recent enforcement actions by the European Commission, or like, investigations, kind of offer some concrete questions of like, how do we assess algorithms? So like TikTok and Meta, for example, are both now being investigated for, addiction, problems and harmful rabbit hole problems. So I was wondering, do you think that we actually understand from a theoretical point of view how to evaluate if an algorithm is, increasing the risk of addiction, increasing the risk of harmful rabbit holes? So like, could the platforms even evaluate that question, and like, how might they do it? And then do you think that we have like the data access provisions for auditors and researchers to validate anything that the platforms say from that point of view?
Thank you so much. So first question goes to David, and I think Martin, the second question is made for you. Of course, if anyone else wants to add, absolutely, Oliver. David, you're first.
Yeah, I guess that there are multiple sources of inspiration for technical committees. Traditionally, with the experience of dealing with standards development or any kind of certification procedures for type approval, etc., focusing only on safety, they can have many elements to get inspiration when it comes to introduce fundamental rights. One of them is also the GDPR. I'm not an expert on the GDPR, so I cannot give too much information about that. But just to visualize better the difficulty, let me put you an example with motor vehicles. No? This is a very well-established sector. We have vehicle type approval regulations. There are a lot of regulations. And then, for example, with automated driving systems, there is more and more components that are based on AI, and they are very safety relevant. It is still that they have to also go through third-party conformity assessment, okay, but if they are affected by the regulation, all this sector that has been traditionally dealing with safety issues, they have now to target fundamental rights perspective. One thing that we have studied at the GRC is, for example, to consider that different levels of safety of these components can be considered as a threat to fundamental rights, depending on for example, the type of person, the specific characteristics of that person. No, that can be one element. But again, it's not just about adding fundamental rights; it's also about the horizontality. No, so many challenges ahead.
Thank you. If that's okay, I would like to start with Martin first, and then you can complement Oliver.
Okay, I'll try to be short so Oliver has the final words. To Jeff, yeah, thanks. I think there are, the problems are not well defined, right? So what is the rabbit hole and what is, what was the other thing? Like addiction, right? But we know that the platforms are interested in doing research in that, right? So the Instagram leaks have shown that they are actually investigating that. So, but they don't come out with that with their results on their own, right? So that's the problem definitely. But I would also say, like for the rabbit hole effect, for example, there's a I don't know if the rabbit hole is not the right question to ask, right? The question would be from the scenario-based approach, what does it actually cause, right? And what do we want to prevent? And from that, develop mitigation measures to how to get people out of the rabbit holes, because they might want to end up there, right? On some days, I just want to watch specific content, and that's fine. The question is, how deep do you end up in that rabbit hole, and how do you get out of it? So.
Yeah, I'd really recommend Martin and Katty's paper on the scenario-based risk approach for precisely this reason. It narrows down the question of sort of causality or not into something more bite-sized and manageable. On the point about the request for information, I think this goes back to what I was saying previously, which is now as civil society looking at these, we're like, wait, does this mean we should look at these things? Or are these precisely the things we shouldn't be looking at because they're already being looked at? And we don't know, you know, is this like, are we all going to rush towards this like watering hole, like gazelles, and like all drink from the same watering hole, or should we not be doing that? It's really hard to know because we're kind of like, these are little flashes of light in the dark. But I would say on the causality point, to step back, as I guess this might be the final point, these are risk assessments in the sense of it's not about necessarily punishing platforms because something bad happened. It's about saying, can you envisage something bad happening, and what steps have you put in place to make sure that it won't, or at least have you at least done good procedures and processes to make sure, or at least minimize the risk of it happening? And these are huge things. Bad things will happen, but it's the ability to have that open conversation and say, did you involve all the right expertise? Did you do all the things to make sure that things that might be causality, might just be plausibility, but there was a plausible risk here and it wasn't met and it wasn't minimized. And this happens in all sorts of fields of life, from climate change to gambling to all sorts. But we are in an unusual situation where the bodies that have the most power and the most accountability are also the ones that have the most data on how to stop it. And that is unusual and very strange. And that is, I think, the problem that this whole exercise is trying to solve. But I think, as we've laid out, is still meeting a lot of quite hard problems.
Thank you so much. It's exactly 5 minutes past 1, so we used every single minute of this panel. Thank you so much for this excellent lineup of speakers, and especially to you, Oliver, and Algorithm Watch, who is the mastermind behind this panel. So thanks again for having us all. Please go and visit websites of each organization listed on the slide. And I do want to also point out that you can submit real cases which may show evidence of systemic risk online on Algorithm Watch website. So if you are aware of those cases, please go ahead and submit those. It will be really appreciated by the research and civil society community. And with that, thank you so much for being here, and enjoy your lunch.